The room was quiet, except for the low hum of my phone, its glow cutting through the late afternoon light as rain tapped against the window. My hands went cold the second I saw the image on the screen, my chest tightening before my mind could catch up. In that frozen moment, I understood something was wrong in a way I couldn't explain, like recognizing a sound you'll never forget. If you've ever trusted someone completely and felt that trust slip through your fingers, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. You're not as alone as you think. I stood there, barefoot on the cool floor, staring at proof I never wanted to see, feeling the weight of a life I thought was solid begin to crack. Nothing made sense, yet everything suddenly did. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just listened to my own heartbeat and felt a version of myself quietly disappear. That was the moment everything started to unravel, and I had no idea how far the truth would carry me once it did. I was finishing an ordinary afternoon when my phone vibrated, and in that small moment, everything I believed about my life began to crack. A photograph sat on my screen, innocent at first glance, until I looked closer and felt my chest tighten in a way I had never known. I remember standing still, as if movement might make the image more real. My breathing slowed, my hands went cold, and disbelief settled over me. There he was, my husband, leaning toward another woman with a familiarity that no explanation could soften. What unsettled me most was not anger. It was the calm realization that this closeness did not belong to me anymore. For years, people had looked at my life and assumed it was effortless, polished, and secure. I had learned to carry that assumption like a shield, even when it felt heavy. In that moment, the shield cracked. I felt the weight of a truth I could no longer ignore, pressing but firmly against my ribs. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply stood there, staring at the proof of a distance I had been trying not to see. Something quiet shifted inside me, something final. That photograph did not destroy my life. It revealed it, and nothing would ever look the same again. I lived in a house people admired from the outside. Wide windows, quiet rooms, furniture chosen to impress guests we rarely had. Friends would smile when they visited, telling me how lucky I was, how beautiful everything looked. I smiled back because it was easier than explaining what the walls never said out loud. Inside that house, silence followed me from room to room. Meals were eaten with phones nearby and attention elsewhere. Criticism arrived more often than affection, usually disguised as advice about how I could do better, be better, fit better. I learned quickly that peace came from agreeing, from smoothing edges, from taking up less space than I needed. There was comfort. Yes, there was security, but there was also a loneliness that crept in during quiet mornings and late evenings, when I realized I could disappear emotionally and no one would notice. I was surrounded by things, yet starved of presence. I began measuring my worth by how little trouble I caused. If everyone else seemed satisfied, I told myself that should be enough. I folded my opinions away, softened my voice, adjusted myself to match the version of me that was easiest to accept. From the outside, my life looked calm and complete. Inside, it felt carefully staged, like a display that never quite belonged to me. And without fully realizing it, I had learned to shrink myself to keep that illusion intact. Every day followed the same quiet pattern, and I told myself this was adulthood, this was marriage, this was stability. Even as a small, persistent voice inside me whispered that something important about who I was remained unseen for far too long. I followed the same routine every morning. Coffee brewed, lights turned off behind me, a quiet goodbye to a house that rarely noticed my absence. From the outside, it looked like I was heading toward errands. A slow day, nothing important. That assumption made everything easier. What no one at home questioned was where I went after pulling out of the driveway. I drove downtown, parked beneath a glass building that hummed with energy, and stepped into a world where my presence mattered. There, people looked up when I entered a room. My ideas were listened to, debated, trusted. I carried responsibility, made decisions, and felt the steady confidence that comes from building something real. I never talked about that part of my life once I returned home. I softened myself again, changed my tone, let my accomplishments stay invisible. I told myself it was kindness. I believed I was protecting my marriage by keeping my success quiet, by not challenging an ego that felt fragile even when it was never spoken aloud. Living this way split me in two. One version of me stood tall during the day, capable and respected. The other learned how to stay agreeable, how to make herself smaller so the peace would hold. Each night, as I slipped back into that role, I felt a quiet exhaustion that sleep never touched. I convinced myself this balance could last. I told myself love required compromise, even when the compromise always seemed to come from me. But beneath the routine, beneath the silence, something was already shifting. The distance I ignored during the day followed me home at night, and the life I hid was slowly revealing cracks I could no longer pretend weren't there. Those cracks warned me that ignoring them would soon become impossible. It didn't happen all at once. It was small things at first, the kind that are easy to explain away when you want to believe nothing is wrong. He came home later than usual, then later again. His attention drifted, his phone never far from his hand, his laughter quieter around me. I noticed patterns before I admitted them, expenses that didn't match our routines, days that repeated too neatly. I would pause, feel that brief tightening in my chest, then release it by telling myself I was overthinking. I blamed stress, I blamed work, I blamed myself for being too sensitive. Silence became my strategy. I told myself keeping the peace mattered more than asking uncomfortable questions. If I didn't speak the fear aloud, maybe it would stay untrue. I adjusted again, smoothed over my doubts, and pretended the distance between us was temporary. There were moments when the truth brushed close, a comment from someone else that lingered too long in my mind, a look that didn't quite fit the story I was telling myself. Each time, I stepped away from the edge, choosing familiarity over uncertainty. Fear has a way of disguising itself as loyalty, and I mistook my hesitation for strength instead of avoidance then. Looking back, I understand that my intuition wasn't quiet. I was the one who muted it. I knew something was wrong long before I had proof. I just wasn't ready to see what was already moving toward me, steadily, patiently, waiting for the moment when denial would no longer protect me. I was sitting alone when the photograph arrived. No warning, no explanation, just an image that demanded to be seen. At first, I didn't understand why my body reacted before my mind did, why my shoulders stiffened and my breath caught. Then I looked closer. There he was, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, leaning toward another woman with an ease that didn't belong to strangers. What broke something open inside me wasn't only his closeness, it was the presence beside them, a face I trusted, someone who had watched me smile through dinners and holidays. Seeing that quiet approval felt heavier than the betrayal itself. The details kept unfolding the longer I stared, the place, the comfort, the small signs of money being spent freely, confidently, as if it were endless and unquestioned. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't just about affection redirected, it was about loyalty violated and trust funded by my own sacrifices. I didn't cry. My body went still, as though it knew tears wouldn't help me understand what I was seeing. The anger passed quickly, replaced by something colder and clearer, a knowing that settled deep and steady. That photograph didn't start my pain, it ended my denial. I saw the truth without decoration or excuse, and I felt something important close quietly inside me. What I felt next wasn't heartbreak, it was resolve, forming slowly, deliberately. As I realized this was the moment I stopped reacting and began deciding, everything ahead shifted because I finally chose myself over illusion and fear. I stayed still for a long time after that moment, not frozen by fear, but steady in a way I had never felt before. The noise inside me quieted, leaving space for thought instead of reaction. I didn't rush. I didn't confront. I let the clarity settle. The next morning looked exactly the same from the outside. I made coffee, answered emails, moved through familiar routines, but everything felt different. Each task carried intention. Every decision felt grounded. I was no longer drifting through my own life. I returned to my work with a focus that surprised even me. Numbers, accounts, schedules, responsibilities. I had once handled automatically, now felt personal. They represented my effort, my time, my protection. I reviewed details carefully, not with anger, but with respect for what I had built and what I needed to preserve. I didn't announce changes. I didn't seek validation. I made quiet choices, one after another, guided by logic instead of emotion. There was power in that silence. It allowed me to think clearly without interruption or persuasion. At one point, I paused and recognized the shift fully. I was no longer asking myself how to fix the situation. I was asking what I required to feel safe, whole, and honest with myself again. That question changed everything. Taking control didn't feel dramatic. It felt calm, almost gentle, like setting something heavy down after carrying it for far too long. By the time the day ended, nothing appeared different to anyone else, but beneath the surface, the first boundaries had already been drawn, and the consequences were quietly moving forward. Whether anyone noticed yet or not, I felt prepared, grounded, and certain that patience, not noise, would guide me as events unfolded in their own unavoidable time from this moment on. I didn't witness the consequences directly at first. I heard about them in fragments, small disruptions rippling through routines that had always felt untouchable to them. Plans stalled, assumptions failed, the ease they moved with began to falter, somewhere else, far from me. Expectations collided with reality. They reached for things the way they always had, confident they would be there when they weren't. Confusion set in. Embarrassment followed. The world didn't bend the way it used to. What struck me wasn't their discomfort, but how quickly entitlement reveals itself when it's interrupted. Comfort had trained them to believe access was guaranteed, that someone else would quietly absorb the cost. That illusion dissolved without a single word from me. I remained at a distance, steady and quiet. I went about my days with intention, aware that what was unfolding was not punishment, but consequence. There was no thrill in it, only a calm understanding that accountability doesn't need an audience. In moments of stillness, I reflected on how often we're taught to explain ourselves, to justify boundaries, to soften truth so others feel comfortable. This time, I didn't. Preparation did the talking for me. Knowing that my silence carried weight was grounding. It reminded me that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply allows reality to arrive unfiltered. As the ripples continued outward, I understood that avoidance was no longer possible. Paths were narrowing, questions were forming. What had been hidden was pressing toward the surface. And soon, the quiet distance I kept would give way to a moment where truth would need to be faced directly, without illusion or escape. And the calm I carried would be tested. I walked into that room aware of the tension before anyone spoke. The air felt tight, expectant, like I was being summoned rather than welcomed. For years, I had learned to be dismissed quietly. That day, I noticed how quickly urgency replaced indifference. They waited for me to fix things, to explain disruptions, to smooth over what no longer worked. I listened without interrupting, noticing how entitlement sounds when it assumes permission. Inside, I felt steady, not angry, ready. I responded with calm facts, not defenses. I spoke about boundaries as realities, not threats. I clarified what belonged to me, what decisions had already been made, and what would not be negotiated anymore. There was no need to raise my voice. Truth carried enough weight on its own. As understanding settled, the room grew silent. The confidence that once filled the space drained away, replaced by the uncomfortable recognition of misjudgment. I felt something loosen in my chest, a release that came from being believed by myself first. I realized then how often power hides behind noise, and how easily it collapses when met with composure. I did not argue. I did not accuse. I simply stood in my place and let the facts remain where they landed. When I finished, there was nothing left to say. The silence spoke for me. I understood, with quiet certainty, that the balance had shifted for good. Whatever came next would unfold without my permission being questioned again, because I had finally claimed it. That moment marked the end of bargaining and the beginning of peace, where my presence was no longer conditional, my voice no longer borrowed, and my future no longer negotiated, but carried forward by the steadiness I had earned through patience, clarity, and a strength I trusted completely now. I didn't watch their lives change all at once. It happened in ordinary moments, the kind that don't make headlines but reshape people quietly. Things they once relied on disappeared, not dramatically, just suddenly absent when expected. Comfort gave way to inconvenience, schedules tightened, choices became limited, small frustrations piled up, the kind that used to be handled by someone else. I noticed how quickly confidence fades when ease is removed. What stood out most were the details: simpler meals, older clothes worn longer than intended, waiting instead of ordering, pausing before spending. These weren't punishments, just reality asserting itself without cushioning. I stayed out of it completely. I didn't intervene or comment. Distance allowed me to observe without anger or satisfaction. Watching from that place felt strangely neutral, almost instructional. Life was teaching lessons I never could have delivered myself. I realized then how often we confuse consequence with cruelty. This wasn't cruelty. It was balance being restored. The absence of excess revealed character, resilience, and discomfort all at once. As time passed, my emotional attachment loosened. I no longer felt responsible for how they adapted or struggled. Their journey was no longer tied to mine. What remained for me was clarity. There was nothing left to prove and nothing left to manage. One final interaction still lingered ahead, not as a battle, but as a necessary closing. I knew it was time to release what was left, quietly, and step forward, without carrying anyone else's weight again, and trusting myself to choose peace over fear, moving forward alone. I chose a small, quiet place to meet, nothing polished or impressive, just neutral ground where no one had an advantage. Sitting across from him, I noticed the changes immediately. His posture was heavier, his confidence muted, shaped by weeks of carrying his own responsibilities without protection. I felt no urge to revisit the past in detail. I explained my decision calmly, without defending it, because it no longer needed defense. I wasn't there to argue or to be understood. I was there to end something cleanly. What surprised me most was the absence of anger inside myself. I could see the regret in him without needing it to heal me. I acknowledged the hurt that had been done without softening it. And I made it clear that the relationship was over, not out of punishment, but out of truth. Forgiveness came quietly, not as approval, not as forgetting, but as a choice to stop carrying resentment forward. I released him from my expectations and released myself from the need for apology or repair. When I stood to leave, it felt simple, final. I didn't look back for reassurance. I walked away knowing that chapter had closed exactly as it needed to, and that what waited for me next wasn't recovery, but freedom. I carried peace with me as I stepped forward alone, grounded, and ready to build a future that belonged entirely to me, with confidence and lasting clarity. I built my days differently after everything ended. Mornings were quieter, chosen by me, shaped around what I needed instead of what I maintained. New spaces became familiar, not because they were impressive, but because they felt honest. I returned to simple routines with intention, walking without rushing, working with focus. Evenings filled with small pleasures that didn't require approval. I noticed how lightness returns when no one is watching you perform for a long time. I believed strength looked loud and visible. Now I understand it often looks like peace. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped shrinking. I let my voice exist without measuring its impact on someone else's comfort. The past didn't disappear. I carried it differently. The scars reminded me of boundaries learned, not mistakes repeated. They no longer defined me. They informed me. What mattered most was the quiet confidence growing inside me. I trusted my choices. I trusted my pace. I allowed joy to arrive without suspicion. This life didn't need to prove anything. It simply needed to be lived fully and honestly. And as I moved forward, grounded and present, I realized the strength I once searched for had been waiting all along, ready to guide me toward meaning, clarity, and lessons that extended far beyond my own story. Those reflections would soon shape how I understood my past and shared its meaning forward. I used to believe that love required silence, that endurance was proof of devotion. I thought if I stayed patient and small enough, respect would eventually find me. What I learned instead is that silence has a cost, and it is almost always paid by the person who is already giving the most. Losing what I thought I had forced me to see who I was without it. Betrayal didn't make me stronger. It made me honest. It stripped away the excuses I used to justify staying where I was unseen, and it returned something I had misplaced along the way, my sense of self. If any part of this story feels familiar, I want you to hear this gently. You are not difficult for wanting respect. You are not ungrateful for noticing absence. And you are not selfish for choosing peace over endurance. The version of you that feels tired may simply be the version that has outgrown silence. What happened to me was painful, but it became a doorway instead of a sentence. It showed me that growth often begins where denial ends, and that clarity, while uncomfortable, is kinder than illusion. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening without judgment. If you feel comfortable, I would love to hear your story. Have you ever stayed quiet longer than you should have, or chosen yourself after being overlooked? Share in the comments if you'd like. I read every message, and your words matter more than you know. You are not alone here, and your courage to listen today already says everything about who you are.